The moment the power grid fails, not flickers, not browns out, but dies, the average person has approximately 72 hours before their decision-making collapses alongside their infrastructure. FEMA's own internal modeling confirms this. 3 days. After that, the psychological pressure of uncertainty, hunger, thirst, and social breakdown begins compressing rational thought into something closer to animal panic. And here is what almost no one in the preparedness community wants to admit openly. Your stockpile will not save you. Your weapons will not save you. Your gear, carefully selected, expensively assembled, obsessively maintained, will eventually run out, break down, or be taken. Every physical resource you have accumulated exists on a timeline that ends. There is only one resource that does not depreciate, cannot be confiscated, cannot rot, cannot run dry, and compounds in value the more desperate the situation becomes. That resource is the ability to think systematically under pressure, what cognitive scientists and military strategists alike call structured adaptive reasoning. This is not a motivational concept. It is a measurable, trainable neurological function, and it is the single variable that separates survivors from casualties across every documented catastrophe in modern history. To understand why, you have to understand what actually kills people in collapse scenarios, because it is almost never what the preparedness industry tells you. The popular narrative focuses on external threats, raiders, starvation, exposure. And those threats are real. But forensic analysis of mass casualty events, from Hurricane Katrina to the 2010 Haiti earthquake to the prolonged grid failures in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, reveals a consistent and deeply uncomfortable pattern. The majority of preventable deaths were not caused by the disaster itself. They were caused by decisions made in the 72 to 120-hour window immediately following the initial event. People who had food made fatal errors accessing it. People who had water made fatal errors purifying it. People who had weapons made fatal errors deploying them. The tools were present. The cognitive framework to use those tools correctly under stress was absent. That gap, between having a resource and being able to deploy it effectively when your prefrontal cortex is being chemically suppressed by sustained cortisol release, is where survival is actually decided. The science here is not theoretical. Neuroscientist Amy Arnson at Yale has spent decades documenting what happens to the prefrontal cortex, the brain center for planning, judgment, and impulse control, under acute and chronic stress. Her research shows that even moderate stress levels cause measurable impairment in working memory, flexible thinking, and risk assessment. Under severe stress, the brain effectively shifts executive control away from the prefrontal cortex and toward the amygdala, which is optimized for rapid threat response but catastrophically poor at complex problem-solving. This is why trained soldiers make errors under fire that seem inexplicable in retrospect. It is why experienced pilots have crashed planes they could have saved. And it is precisely why a person who has spent years accumulating survival gear can stand in front of a water filter they own, in a crisis they prepared for, and fail to use it correctly. Their amygdala is running the operation. Their prefrontal cortex has been biochemically sidelined. What structured adaptive reasoning does, and why it is the one skill that cannot be taken from you, is that it builds what psychologists call automatized executive function. Through repeated, deliberate practice in high cognitive load environments, specific reasoning patterns become encoded not just in conscious memory but in procedural memory. They become, in the truest neurological sense, instinctive. Military SERE training, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape, is built on exactly this principle. The physical skills taught in SERE are secondary. The primary objective is to rehearse structured decision-making under simulated stress until that structure survives the cortisol flood. When a SERE-trained operator faces genuine collapse conditions, they do not think about what to do next. They execute a thinking process that has been drilled so deeply it persists even when conscious deliberation is impaired. That is the architecture of real survival capability. Everything else, every knife, every rifle, every freeze-dried meal, is simply the material those decisions act upon. Without the cognitive framework, The material is inert at best and dangerous at worst. This is the truth that outlasts every tool, every weapon, every stockpile ever assembled. The grid can fall. The supply chains can collapse. The cash can be lost. But a mind trained to reason systematically through chaos carries its capability into every scenario, requires no batteries, weighs nothing, and grows more valuable with every crisis it navigates. The question then becomes one of method, and this is where the preparedness community has made its most costly intellectual error. The assumption embedded in nearly every survival forum, every gear review channel, every bug-out checklist ever published, is that preparation is fundamentally a logistics problem. Acquire enough of the right things, store them correctly, and you have solved survival. But logistics without cognition is simply inventory. And inventory, as every collapse scenario in recorded history demonstrates, degrades. What does not degrade, what in fact strengthens under pressure, is a decision-making architecture that has been stress-tested, refined, and automatized through deliberate practice. The military understood this long before the civilian preparedness world acknowledged it. The Roman legions drilled not to teach soldiers how to fight, but to encode tactical reasoning so deeply into muscle and mind that it survived the chaos of actual battle. The same principle appears in the training doctrine of every elite military unit operating today. The Israeli Defense Forces, the British SAS, the United States Army Rangers, none of these organizations trust gear alone. They trust trained cognition operating through gear. The gear is the instrument. The trained mind is the musician. Remove the musician and the instrument produces nothing. Consider what this means in practical, measurable terms. A 2019 study published in the journal Frontiers in Psychology examined decision quality among individuals with formal structured reasoning training versus untrained individuals during simulated emergency scenarios. The trained group demonstrated not only faster initial decisions but significantly fewer catastrophic errors, defined as decisions that worsened the survival situation, under identical high-stress conditions. The untrained group, despite having equivalent access to resources and information, defaulted consistently to what researchers called familiarity bias, choosing actions that felt safe because they resembled normal life behaviors, even when those actions were objectively counterproductive in the crisis context. This is the misunderstanding that costs lives at scale. People believe they will rise to the occasion. The neuroscience is unambiguous. Under severe stress, people fall to the level of their training. If that training is shallow, reactive, and gear-dependent, that is precisely the level to which they fall. And in a genuine SHTF environment, that level is frequently not enough. The survival implication of this evidence is both clarifying and demanding. It means that the most important preparation you can undertake has nothing to do with purchasing, storing, or maintaining physical resources. It means sitting with genuinely difficult problems, logistical, social, medical, navigational, under conditions of artificial time pressure and incomplete information, and forcing your brain to produce structured outputs anyway. It means after-action analysis of those outputs, identifying where reasoning collapsed, where assumption replaced evidence, where emotion displaced logic. It means doing this repeatedly, systematically, and honestly, until the process itself becomes as automatic as breathing. Scenario planning done at this level of cognitive seriousness is not a hobby. It is neurological infrastructure construction. You are literally rewiring the architecture of your stress response so that when the cortisol floods your system and your amygdala demands control, there is a competing pathway, deeply grooved, repeatedly reinforced, that keeps structured thought online even in conditions designed to destroy it. This also reframes the value of every other survival skill in your repertoire. Firemaking, water purification, medical triage, navigation, communication. None of these skills exist in isolation. Each one is a decision tree that must be executed correctly under pressure, with incomplete information, in sequence, while simultaneously managing other threats. The person who has practiced fire-making 100 times in comfortable conditions will fail that skill in a storm, injured, at altitude, with wet materials and failing daylight, if they have not also trained their mind to systematically work through degraded conditions. The skill and the cognitive framework that deploys the skill are inseparable in real application. Treating them as separate, collecting skills like gear, assuming they will perform on demand, is the same category of error as assuming your stockpile will last indefinitely. Skills, like gear, degrade without the cognitive infrastructure to maintain and deploy them under stress. What you are building, when you train structured adaptive reasoning alongside every physical survival skill you develop, is something that no disaster can locate, no adversary can confiscate, and no supply chain disruption can interrupt. It travels with you at zero weight. It requires no maintenance beyond continued practice. It does not expire. In a world where every external resource exists on a timeline that ends, the trained human mind operating through a practiced reasoning architecture is the only survival asset that genuinely compounds, growing more capable, more resilient, and more valuable the harder the conditions it faces. That is not a philosophy. That is the most evidence-supported conclusion the science of human performance under stress has ever produced. And in the moment everything else fails, it will be the only thing left standing between you and the void.